In this video I'm wanting to look at how you can utilize type in Illustrator. It's a little bit more complex than a lot of programs are because in Illustrator it treats it first as type, but that you can also treat it as shapes. And Illustrator is also one of those programs where you have to embed your type in order to transfer the files over cleanly. Otherwise it doesn't really work. You'll leave the typeface behind more or less. So knowing how to handle type in Illustrator is really important, especially if you are moving files from one place to the other. What I'm going to do is pull out the type tool, which is like any Adobe product. It is a capital T. If you hover over it, it says type tool. And there's two different ways I can draw out text here. One is to actually draw out a text box by clicking and dragging, but this is not really the preferable way to do it unless you intend to do something in a paragraph or in a column, something like that. Really the easiest way to handle type in Illustrator is to use the type tool and just click one time and you'll get a blinking cursor. Now if I type out a phrase, there's several things that I can do to make my life easier with this, one of which is going back to my arrow. I can just use my parameters at the top and do something like increase the size of the type. By increasing the size up here is based on real-world measurements. These are points. 72 points is 1 inch. But when I'm working digitally, unless I'm doing something for print that has body text that I want to make sure is legible, it's not really important that I confine it to these specific measurements. Really, the easiest thing to do is to treat it like a shape, scale it up, holding shift in order to scale it up and keep it in proportion to get it the size that I want. I do have to really warn you to be careful when working with this, however, because if I begin to scale it up and I just pull from the corner and I allow it to stretch, or if I pull from the corner and allow it to compress, the text does not look as good. This is a big mistake that people tend to make when they're working with type, is allowing it to warp, or even worse, forcing it to warp in order to get it to fit into certain areas. Now if I really needed to, a little bit of compression honestly is not that big of a deal to get it to fit somewhere that I want it to. It's when that becomes more extreme, such as this, or stretching the other direction, this. The reason why this creates problems, if I zoom in, you can see how it alters the weight of the stroke in each letter. For example, this C should be equal all the way through, but because I have stretched it, it has thinned the vertical portion and it has thickened the horizontal portions. It no longer looks like the typeface that it was. I've effectively ruined it. So stretching and warping text is typically a big taboo when it comes to graphic design, so try to avoid doing that under any circumstance. If it's really necessary for you to spread text or make it wider or compress it, we can look at ways to do that here in just a minute. The main thing that I want to point out with this is type. I can edit it, I can go back to the type tool, I can change it, and because of that I can't do something like, if I really wanted to, erase part of it. Doesn't work. But there is a way around that. What I'm going to do is, with it selected with my arrow, I'm going to go up to the type menu and there's an option here that says create outlines. Now if I do that, you'll notice the selection changes and surprise, I can no longer edit the text with my type tool. So basically I have converted it to a shape, and through that I can no longer edit the text, so I better be happy and be sure that I have no typos. Now there is one more thing that I have to do before I can do what I want and really erase through it. The eraser actually works just fine, but if I wanted to do the pathfinder, such as we looked at in a previous video, and cut through it, it doesn't work quite that easily. What I'd have to do is go up to Object and Ungroup. Now the reason I have to do that is because each of these letters are separate, but I can still move them in tandem. If I want to move the letters by themselves, if I want to use the pathfinder to cut through something, which does not work on groups or on multiple objects at once, I have to go up to Object and Ungroup. Anytime that you put something through an automated process in Illustrator, it will group them. Image trace does it, outlining text does it, outlining strokes along with shapes does it. It does it in a lot of different situations, so always check. If something is not grouped, I can go up to Object and you'll see how Ungroup is now grayed out. That means that no group is in existence right now. So if it's visible, you have a group, and that's the cause of a lot of problems when students are working with the Pathfinder or trying to cut through a shape that happens to be one of their letters. Now, this outline stroke method that we used is one way of embedding the text into your design. So this is no longer an issue if I was to send this somewhere. They no longer need the typeface because I have converted it over. But again, the text can no longer be edited. But because of this, I can now use these different letters however I want to. I can resize them if I want to get different typographic results. And this freedom and this pure point-and-click interface gives me some really great options and really opens me up for logo design, for type design, about anything like that. So this is really rewarding once you get there. Just be sure that you have the type the way that you want it. I can still do things like change the color of the text because, again, it is still a shape. I can even add a stroke around it if I really wanted to. That's much too big, something like that. So it is still behaves like a shape, you just can no longer edit it as text, and that's something that's very, very useful to remember. One last thing I'm going to show before I kind of run out of time here. I'm going to go ahead and type out something else, and I'll show you just a couple of things. Again, this is prior to conversion, so this is still text. You can't do this type of thing after you converted it. Underneath the character panel at the top, it gives me options like Kern and Tracking, kerning and tracking. And what this allows me to do is, let's say if I take my type tool and I select between these two letters, I can use the kern under this option to reduce or increase that spacing between those individual letters. Or I can select all of these, and using tracking I can expand my letters. Now the cap right there is 200, but I can always enter in my own number to continue to spread it. This is why it's unnecessary to warp text. There's never really a good reason unless you're actually doing some type of artistic commentary on the type itself. But for purposes of clarity, do not stretch and warp text.